The morning sun filtered through the dusty windows of Oakland County Courthouse as Sarah Johnson hurried up the worn marble steps. Her simple Toyota Camry sat in the parking lot, a deliberate choice for someone who could afford any luxury vehicle. The courthouse's imposing facade loomed before her, its classical columns a reminder of justice's supposed blindness. Sarah had spent the morning negotiating a multi-billion-dollar deal over video conference with investors from Shanghai. She hadn't had time to change from her casual attire. Dark jeans, a navy cotton t-shirt, and comfortable flats. Her natural hair was pulled back in a simple bun, with a few rebellious coils framing her face. No designer labels, no flashy jewelry, nothing that screamed billionaire tech CEO. The wood-paneled courtroom buzzed with quiet conversation as Sarah took her seat in the waiting area. Around her, other defendants dressed in their Sunday best fidgeted nervously. A young mother tried to quiet her baby. An elderly man in a threadbare suit clutched his paperwork with trembling hands. Sarah noticed how the bailiff's eyes lingered on her casual attire, his lip curling slightly in disapproval. Judge William Peterson's entrance silenced the room. His steel-gray hair and pressed black robes exuded authority, but there was something else in his bearing. A hint of weariness, perhaps boredom, from seeing what he assumed were the same types of people day after day. His gaze swept the room, categorizing and dismissing each person based on split-second judgments. When Sarah's name was called, she approached the bench with quiet confidence. The charge was simple: a parking violation outside her company's downtown office during a crucial investor meeting. The fine was $275. A trivial amount for someone of her means, but the principle mattered. Judge Peterson peered down at her over his reading glasses, his expression hardening at her casual appearance. "Ms. Johnson," he drawled, emphasizing each syllable as if speaking to a child, "do you understand that this courthouse deserves a certain level of respect? Your attire suggests otherwise." The other attendees shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A few exchanged knowing glances, all too familiar with such treatment. Sarah stood straight, her expression neutral but her eyes sharp and observant. She had faced such prejudices before, used them to her advantage, and built an empire while others underestimated her. Little did Judge Peterson know, he was about to learn a valuable lesson about appearances and assumptions. The tension in the room crackled like static electricity before a storm, as the next few moments would transform a routine traffic hearing into a story that would spark conversations across the nation about bias, dignity, and the true meaning of justice. The morning sun filtered through the dusty windows of Oakland County Courthouse as Sarah Johnson hurried up the worn marble steps. Her simple Toyota Camry sat in the parking lot, a deliberate choice for someone who could afford any luxury vehicle. The courthouse's imposing facade loomed before her, its classical columns a reminder of justice's supposed blindness. Sarah had spent the morning negotiating a multi-billion-dollar deal over video conference with investors from Shanghai. She hadn't had time to change from her casual attire. Dark jeans, a navy cotton t-shirt, and comfortable flats. Her natural hair was pulled back in a simple bun, with a few rebellious coils framing her face. No designer labels, no flashy jewelry, nothing that screamed billionaire tech CEO. The wood-paneled courtroom buzzed with quiet conversation as Sarah took her seat in the waiting area. Around her, other defendants dressed in their Sunday best fidgeted nervously. A young mother tried to quiet her baby. An elderly man in a threadbare suit clutched his paperwork with trembling hands. Sarah noticed how the bailiff's eyes lingered on her casual attire, his lip curling slightly in disapproval. Judge William Peterson's entrance silenced the room. His steel-gray hair and pressed black robes exuded authority, but there was something else in his bearing. A hint of weariness, perhaps boredom, from seeing what he assumed were the same types of people day after day. His gaze swept the room, categorizing and dismissing each person based on split-second judgments. When Sarah's name was called, she approached the bench with quiet confidence. The charge was simple: a parking violation outside her company's downtown office during a crucial investor meeting. The fine was $275, a trivial amount for someone of her means, but the principle mattered. Judge Peterson peered down at her over his reading glasses, his expression hardening at her casual appearance. "Miss Johnson," he drawled, emphasizing each syllable as if speaking to a child, "do you understand that this courthouse deserves a certain level of respect? Your attire suggests otherwise." The other attendees shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A few exchanged knowing glances, all too familiar with such treatment. Sarah stood straight, her expression neutral but her eyes sharp and observant. She had faced such prejudices before, used them to her advantage, and built an empire while others underestimated her. Little did Judge Peterson know, he was about to learn a valuable lesson about appearances and assumptions. The tension in the room crackled like static electricity before a storm, as the next few moments would transform a routine traffic hearing into a story that would spark conversations across the nation about bias, dignity, and the true meaning of justice. Judge Peterson's voice carried across the hushed courtroom like a whip crack. "Ms. Johnson, perhaps in your neighborhood, this kind of casual disregard for authority is acceptable, but in my courtroom, we have standards." His words dripped with condescension as he shuffled through her paperwork, making a show of his disapproval. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Sarah stood perfectly still, her face a mask of calm. Other defendants watched the scene unfold, some looking down at their feet, others unable to tear their eyes away from the familiar display of prejudice dressed up as authority. A young law clerk in the corner frantically scribbled notes, her brow furrowed with concern. "A simple parking violation," the judge continued, tapping his fingers on the bench. "But what I see here is a pattern of disrespect. First, you couldn't be bothered to park legally, and now you appear before this court dressed like you're heading to a casual lunch." He paused for effect, clearly enjoying his moment of power. "The standard fine is $275, but given your apparent disregard for our institutions, I'm exercising my discretion to increase it to $500. A collective intake of breath whispered through the courtroom. The increase was clearly excessive, and everyone knew it. An elderly woman in the back row shook her head slightly, her lips pressed into a thin line of disapproval. The court reporter's fingers hesitated for a moment over her stenotype machine before continuing their rhythmic clicking. Sarah's hands remained clasped in front of her, her shoulders straight. She'd faced boardrooms full of skeptical investors, navigated hostile takeover attempts, and built a tech empire from nothing. This small-minded display of authority didn't rattle her. Instead, she carefully observed the judge's behavior, noting every microaggression, every assumption written across his face. The bailiff shifted uncomfortably, having seen this scene play out before with different faces, different stories, but always the same underlying current of bias. A ray of sunlight broke through the clouds outside, casting a sudden spotlight through the high windows onto Sarah's simple gold wedding band, the only piece of jewelry she wore. "Do you understand the fine I've imposed, Ms. Johnson?" Judge Peterson leaned forward, expecting to see defeat or desperation in her eyes. He was accustomed to people begging for reduced fines or payment plans. The slight smile playing at the corners of Sarah's mouth confused him. Something was about to change in his courtroom, though he didn't know it yet. The next few moments would shatter his preconceptions and become a powerful reminder that justice, true justice, sees beyond appearances. "Very well, Your Honor," Sarah spoke softly, reaching into her worn leather messenger bag. The judge's eyes followed her movements, expecting to see a crumpled checkbook or perhaps food stamps. Instead, she pulled out a sleek business card embossed with the distinctive blue and silver logo of TechVision Enterprises. The young law clerk's eyes widened in recognition. She quickly tapped something into her phone, then showed it to her colleague, who nearly dropped his coffee cup. The whispers started at the back of the courtroom and rippled forward like a wave. "I apologize for my attire today," Sarah continued, her voice clear and measured. "I rushed here directly from a video conference with the Chinese Investment Coalition. We're finalizing a $3.2 billion clean energy project." She placed her business card on the judge's bench. I'm Sarah Johnson, CEO of TechVision Enterprises. Judge Peterson's face underwent a remarkable transformation. First came confusion, then disbelief, followed by the slow dawn of recognition. His hand trembled slightly as he picked up the business card. The same Sarah Johnson who had graced the cover of Forbes last month. The woman who had transformed a small tech startup into a $50 billion company. A reporter who happened to be covering routine court cases that day frantically began taking notes. This was no ordinary courtroom drama. The woman standing before them had revolutionized solar energy technology and was known for her generous philanthropic work in underprivileged communities. I parked in that spot, Sarah explained, because our AI security system detected a potential breach, and I needed to reach our servers immediately. Sometimes, emergency situations require quick decisions. Her voice remained respectful, but carried the unmistakable authority of someone who managed thousands of employees and moved global markets with her decisions. The courtroom had fallen so silent you could hear the old wall clock ticking. The same people who had earlier cast sympathetic glances now stared in amazement. The elderly woman in the back row smiled knowingly, as if she had suspected all along that there was more to this humble-looking woman than met the eye. Judge Peterson's earlier condescension had evaporated, replaced by visible discomfort. The power dynamic had shifted dramatically. Though Sarah's demeanor hadn't changed one bit, she stood exactly as before, waiting patiently for his response, a living testament to the danger of judging books by their covers. Would you like me to expand Part 4 next? Judge Peterson's face had turned an interesting shade of red as he stared at his computer screen, hastily pulled up during the uncomfortable silence. There on his monitor was Sarah Johnson's profile, founder and CEO of TechVision Enterprises, valued at over $50 billion. The same woman he'd just attempted to humiliate over a parking ticket was responsible for creating thousands of jobs and developing breakthrough green energy technology. His hand shook slightly as he scrolled through articles about her. Last month's Forbes cover story titled, "The Quiet Revolutionary," showed her in similar casual attire, praised for her humble leadership style, and groundbreaking innovations in sustainable energy. The Wall Street Journal had recently credited her company with making solar power accessible to low-income communities across America. The courtroom remained silent, but the atmosphere had changed dramatically. The bailiff, who had earlier smirked at Sarah's casual appearance, now stood straight and professional. The young law clerk was furiously typing on her phone, likely sharing this incredible moment with colleagues. Everyone could sense they were witnessing something extraordinary. I apologize, Ms. Johnson," Judge Peterson stammered, his earlier arrogance deflating like a punctured balloon. "I was unaware of your position." His eyes darted between her simple outfit and the impressive achievements listed on his screen, struggling to reconcile the two. Sarah tilted her head slightly, studying him with the same analytical mind that had solved complex technological challenges. "My position shouldn't matter, Your Honor," she said softly, but her words carried clearly through the hushed courtroom. "Every person who enters this courtroom deserves the same respect, regardless of their title or bank account." The reporter in the back had abandoned his notepad for rapid typing on his phone. This story was too good to wait. Local business owner being lectured about responsibility by a judge, only to be revealed as one of the most successful entrepreneurs in the country. It was pure gold. Judge Peterson attempted to regain his composure, but the damage was done. His previous assumptions and biases lay exposed, as naked as the emperor in his new clothes. The other defendants in the courtroom watched with a mixture of satisfaction and vindication, witnessing justice of an unexpected kind being served. "Would you like me to expand Part 5 next?" Sarah stood at the podium, her presence now commanding the courtroom's full attention. Rather than showing anger or seeking revenge, she chose a different path. "Your Honor, with your permission, I'd like to share something with the court." Her voice was steady, carrying the weight of years of experience. She began telling her story, not of her billions, but of her beginnings. Growing up in a small apartment above her grandmother's corner store, watching her single mother work 3 jobs to make ends meet, how she'd started coding on a second-hand computer, learning late into the night after finishing her shift at a local diner. 10 years ago, she continued, I stood in a courtroom much like this one, fighting a traffic ticket I couldn't afford to pay. The judge there didn't see a future tech innovator. He saw exactly what you saw today. Someone who didn't belong. The courtroom hung on her every word. Even the usually stoic bailiff found himself leaning forward slightly. Sarah pulled out her checkbook, not the corporate one, but her personal account. I'll pay the $500 fine, Your Honor. But I hope this moment teaches us all something about quick judgments. She wrote the check with deliberate care, each stroke of her pen punctuating the silence. The young mother who had been nervously bouncing her baby earlier wiped away tears. The elderly man with the trembling hands nodded slowly, his eyes bright with understanding. They weren't just witnessing a wealthy woman putting a judge in his place. They were seeing someone stand up for everyone who had ever been wrongly judged. Judge Peterson's face had moved beyond red to a deep purple. The same hands that had so confidently wielded authority minutes ago now fidgeted with his reading glasses. The power dynamics hadn't just shifted. They had been completely transformed by Sarah's quiet dignity. But after I pay this fine, Sarah continued, I would like to discuss establishing a legal aid fund for this courthouse, because the next person you see in casual clothes might not be a CEO. They might be a single parent rushing from their 3rd job, or a student between classes, but they all deserve equal respect under the law. Would you like me to expand Part 6 next? The courthouse clerk's social media post spread like wildfire through the internet. Just witnessed something incredible, she wrote, describing how a judge's prejudiced treatment of a woman in casual clothes backfired spectacularly. Within hours, the story had been shared thousands of times, each repost adding to the growing conversation about bias in the justice system. Major news networks picked up the story by afternoon. Security camera footage from the courtroom showed Sarah's composed demeanor, contrasting sharply with the judge's visible discomfort. Social media exploded with hashtags. #Don'tJudgeUniliAppearance and #SarahJohnsonEffect started trending worldwide. People began sharing their own stories of facing discrimination in courtrooms, schools, and workplaces. A young programmer wrote about being mistaken for the janitor at his own company. A female doctor described patients assuming she was a nurse. Sarah's story had opened a floodgate of similar experiences. TechVision's stock price jumped as investors responded to their CEO's display of grace under pressure. Business schools scrambled to add the incident to their ethics curricula. Law schools began using the video as a teaching tool about judicial conduct and implicit bias. The reporter who witnessed the incident published a detailed article that went viral, $1 billion Lesson in Humility. How a traffic court judge learned not to judge a CEO by her clothes. The story reached millions, resonating with people from all walks of life who had experienced similar prejudice. Local community leaders praised Sarah's response, noting how she could have reacted with anger, but chose education instead. Civil rights organizations reached out to partner with her on initiatives to combat systemic bias. What started as a simple traffic violation hearing had transformed into a national conversation about respect, dignity, and equal treatment under the law. Would you like me to expand the final part next? Judge Peterson's public apology came 3 days after the incident went viral. Standing before TV cameras on the courthouse steps, he admitted his biases and announced a complete overhaul of courthouse procedures. His voice trembled as he described how Sarah Johnson's dignity in the face of discrimination had forced him to confront his own prejudices. The changes began immediately. Sarah's newly established Justice for All Foundation pledged $10 million to support legal education and assistance programs. The Foundation's first initiative provided free legal representation to low-income defendants and training for court officials about unconscious bias. The courthouse transformed into a model of reform. New guidelines required judges to undergo monthly sensitivity training. The diverse advisory board, including community members from all backgrounds, was established to monitor courtroom conduct. Signs in multiple languages now welcomed visitors, and a free clothing closet provided appropriate attire for those who needed it. Other courthouses across the country began adopting what became known as the Johnson Protocol. The simple practice of treating every person with equal respect, regardless of appearance or status, was revolutionary in its simplicity. Within months, 20 states had implemented similar reforms. Sarah's story became required reading in law schools nationwide. Students studied how a 15-minute traffic court hearing sparked a national movement for judicial reform. The lesson wasn't just about avoiding discrimination. It was about the power of responding to prejudice with grace and constructive action. 1 year later, Sarah returned to the same courthouse, this time as a keynote speaker for their annual Justice for All conference. The same judge who had tried to humiliate her now sat in the audience, nodding as she described how that day had changed both their lives. The courthouse's transformation wasn't just physical, it was a fundamental shift in how justice was administered. The most powerful change, however, was in the daily interactions within the courthouse. Gone were the dismissive glances and assumptions based on appearance. In their place was a new culture of respect, where every person who walked through those doors was treated with the dignity they deserved, regardless of what they wore or who they appeared to be.